sometimes it's better for me to just sit back, bite my tongue, and then in 4 years I'll be able to say what I want.
There has been a gradual institutionalization of this code of conduct, the effect of which is to prevent people from ventilating their views. Bright students won't put up with it.
Buckley Fellows believe that all perspectives must be heard and examined in good faith.
They stand united against the formation of a liberal-only echo chamber at Yale.
We disagree, we debate, and then at the end of the day, we remain friends.
Welcome everyone to Pod and Man at Yale. As always, I'm your host, Ari Schaefer, Director of Communications here at the Buckley Institute. I'm happy to have with me Senior Anshul Guha.
Hello, great to be here.
And Kevin Baisden, a third-year law student at Yale Law School.
Hey, what's up, folks? Happy to be here.
Thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it. What we're talking about today is being conservative at Yale. Being conservative on most college campuses has never been an easy prospect. Yale Daily News did a survey in October before the election. 82% of Yale students said they plan to support Kamala Harris. A lot of students at Yale clearly left-leaning. So what was Yale like for you guys, both undergrad and at the law school, in the run-up to the last election, politically speaking? Anshul?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I definitely think that people were a little bit more on edge. They were concerned. Mostly they wanted Kamala Harris to win, and there were concerns over what might happen to the higher education space if Trump and he did, but if Trump pulled off the victory. And I think the most important thing for me as a conservative on campus at that time was to make sure that I was continuing to speak out, or continuing, for example, to participate in the Buckley program, and making sure that my views were heard, just so that there was this opposing view on campus. And I'm not even the most Trump fan, you could say, or MAGA leaning, but definitely it's important to have conservative voices on campus, especially at times when higher education is kind of maybe a little bit more riled up than it normally is, which isn't saying much.
How about you, Kevin? What was it like at the law school?
Yeah, I think the law school in some ways is distinctively different. There was some, let's call it mild hysteria, and even, some panic type behavior, but it was, I think, less to do, well, let's bifurcate this. The students and then, the environment outside of the students. I think some of the political concerns and let's call it Trumpism, MAGAism, and how that's perceived by the public, I think got a lot more, was a little bit more pronounced from the student body. I think from the faculty and then, in more academic conversations with students and faculty, it was more about the legal concerns around what a Trump presidency could present. So issues like, if he appoints another justice, the constitutionality of things like, as we now see, birthright citizenship is on the table, and a lot of very, controversial policy initiatives and even legal rulings, separation between, the administration and judicial independence, like all of these kind of things that we now start to see take, precedent in the headlines, I think were probably more of a concern academically and from the faculty versus the, let's call it orange man bad, type of popular sentiment.
So what was it like to, I don't know if you guys were Trump supporters, that's not what I'm asking here. What was it like for people who did support Trump, undergrad and law school? Do you think, did they have to kind of hide their support? Do you think that was, as easy as supporting Kamala Harris, for example? What was that aspect of the run-up to the election like?
This is Anshul, by the way, but but yeah, I can actually answer this, and the answer is a little bit different from what I think a lot of people would expect on Yale's campus. I was maybe in 8th grade during Trump's 2016 run, and now I'm a senior in college, so big difference. But from what I can remember between those two, it's definitely the case that Trump supporters, even on college campuses, were more able to or felt more free to speak out or enthusiastically support Trump than, say, they were in 2016. Just as an example, in my high school, and, at that time, my high school was, pretty balanced to red. But after Trump won, they kind of ran like a 3-minute long, essentially anti-Trump morning announcements routine. Oh, wow. And that was pretty interesting. I mean, I didn't know much back then, but it seemed pretty biased to me. And I don't think something like that would happen today at Yale. And I think generally things have improved for people who want to publicly support Trump. Again, most importantly, if you're conservative, you are rare, and so you should really be especially careful about not self-censoring yourself. And that's a valuable addition to the campus culture.
So how about you, Kevin? What was it like at the law school?
So, I'm just thinking back to a couple of observations. Leading up to the election, you would see a number of students, Harris walls, campaign merchandise, different things posted around the law school that you can attribute to students, endorsing or I guess let's call it sympathizing with the Democratic Party. I don't think, at least on campus, I saw a single person wearing a MAGA hat. Right now, outside of campus, and then my circle of conservatives, whatever, that kind of stuff isn't as uncommon. But I do think at least voicing one's opinion, I didn't self-censor. None of my closest friends at the law school self-censored. Even in classes, I'm just thinking back to my federal course class, which, is taught by a very famous, constitutional scholar who is, I think, balanced, definitely liberal. I would have no issue, espousing or endorsing a conservative viewpoint leading up to the election. However, I mean, let's once the sun goes down, I think it was a little bit of a different issue, because I remember Halloween, and I'm driving through downtown New Haven, and I see so many people who look like Yaleys, and the garbage man vest, with the comb over wigs, dressing for Halloween. And I was like, wait a minute. Maybe, and some of it may be satire, et cetera. And I did even see some of that at the law school, but people didn't seem to be as, closeted about their political
100%.
beliefs
100%.
as what I experienced in 2015, 2016, right?
Yes, I 100% agree with this. It's definitely the case that this time around people were a lot more open supporting Trump. And I think, just to add on to that, there have been less direct protests over Trump coming into power this time around. I think partially that might have to do with how the October 7th or like pro-Hamas protests played out a couple months before his inauguration. But this time around, not many protests. The few people who did openly support Trump felt pretty free to support him on campus. And I'm happy that's a good change to have come around.
So I do want to talk about that, drill that down into that a little bit more. What do you think triggered this kind of comfort with being more publicly pro-Trump, more publicly conservative on campus?
I think part of it is good, bad, or indifferent. Donald Trump version 2.0 is the devil that we know versus the devil that we don't. We've already had one Trump presidency. And we can do a postmortem, in a way that you couldn't really do in 2016. So there's that. I also don't think that the left did themselves any favors in isolating, effectively a good portion of their core base. And I've seen this at Yale and out in the community. There are a lot of people who did not vote for Donald Trump, who would call themselves Democrats, who will also say that I'm glad that he's president, right? And how much people are willing to admit that, I think at Yale and then, around their liberal friends, I don't know, but, I've definitely have had those conversations on multiple occasions. It just doesn't sting as much. Like, people have, I wouldn't say it's been erased from the public's conscious, but, January the 6th, the tear gassing of, the protesters at the White House in 2020, like all of those things people know are true and can be attributed to Trump, and whatever culpability you want to assign to him is debatable. But, it's hard to make those symbolic arguments when people are putting $8 worth of gas in their cars and living off of, ramen noodles. Some people just have different priorities. Some of them at Yale and some of them otherwise. And I think that's where the level of comfortability around kind of being open about it may result from.
And if I could add on to that, I think that's a perfect answer. I would say that part of it comes down to Trump running a much better campaign this time around than he did, in 2016. Well, first of all, Trump was an aberration in 2016. No one really expected him to win.
I don't think he expected him to win.
Well, I guess except for himself.
No,
right?
I don't know. Like, you look at kind of the post-planning, like, did you even think you were going to win this thing?
Well, yeah, right, totally. And I think no one really expected him to win. Now in 2024, it was pretty clear that there was a good chance that he was going to pull it off. And on top of that, he did run a much better campaign than he ran in 2016, maybe because the people on his campaign actually possibly thought he had a chance to win. But it's, if you look at the national statistics, he's been able to move a lot of, I guess you could call it traditionally Democratic groups to the right. Young men, I think, moved very far to the right this election than last time around. Asian Americans, Latinos, a lot of these other things. And these aren't just national trends. They also apply on campus. There are Latinos and Asian Americans and young men, a lot of young men on college campuses. And I think that is definitely part of the reason why Trump was received better on college campuses than he was last time around.
So I want to get at this idea because it's something I've heard about a vibe shift. And so I remember early in the 2024 campaign, they're talking about vibes, and, Kamala Harris was like, it's going to be a vibe election. And it turns out the vibes went the other way.
Brat Summer was not a good idea.
Brat Summer did not pan out. It does feel like they're, at least in my experience, like watching the news, seeing how students talk about, Trump and being conservative, like there is a vibe shift, right? There's a vibe shift in how we talk about being conservative and the ideas that Trump promoted and pushed and conservatives pushed. Do you guys feel that vibe shift on campus, in your classes, in your social circles?
I think that as men who, on balance are probably less sensitive to social costs among our friend groups, guys are just prone to be a little bit more open about like, hey, I like this candidate versus this candidate. And if there is a social cost that I have to pay, like either I'll pay it or like I'll keep my mouth shut in a way that I think, folks who are a lot more sensitive to those kind of things may be a lot more closeted, if that makes sense.
How about you, Anshul? Do you feel a vibe shift?
Yeah, certainly. When I talk to my friends on college campuses, and again, mostly liberal friends, I have conversations with them, and I think the major difference is not just that they're willing to consider Trump's ideas, and even if they disagree, we might have a conversation and they say, well, I don't really agree with ending birthright citizenship, for example. But maybe a couple of years ago, the whole idea that young people could plausibly be conservative in large numbers was just not a thing, and so even the discussion wouldn't happen. And I'm just happy that the discussion is now happening. And that's a step forward. And maybe the step after that is, okay, now that the discussion is happening, how do we convince not just large numbers of, young men and maybe even young women? Actually, by the way, young women did do better for Trump than the pollsters expected.
Absolutely.
And so I would say that this is a big issue. I would say, the Republican Party should really focus on this issue, where it's a conversation now. It's a real conversation amongst young men and women about, general conservative policies and if they agree with them or not. And now is the time to try to get into the podcasts or get into various, forms of media that young people focus on and try to make the affirmative case for conservative policy because now they're listening.
So you mentioned earlier also, Anshul, about the importance of speaking up in your first and I think second answer. Do you feel it's easier to speak up now, in this kind of post-Trump or post-Trump second election era on campus? Do you feel the atmosphere is more open, more receptive?
So I would have to put a disclaimer on this and say it's never been good. It's never been good on an absolute level. It always takes more courage to speak up with the conservative viewpoint than it does to speak up with the liberal viewpoint. And, this is true even if you hold some liberal viewpoints, some conservative viewpoints, you're going to be more hesitant to talk about whatever viewpoints are in the minority. And that's almost always a conservative one. That being said, I would say that it has gotten a little bit easier, but I think most importantly, and even more importantly than how much easier it's gotten, I think it just requires conservatives on campus and even people with mixed views to consider their conservative viewpoints and realize, the whole point of a liberal arts education is that we get all of the different viewpoints and we debate them equally and in good faith. And if you have a minority viewpoint, it's actually almost an obligation as a student in a liberal arts college that you make sure that viewpoint is, brought up. Maybe you're bringing it up. Maybe you encourage other people to bring it up who share that viewpoint with you. But if you have that viewpoint, you have an obligation almost to try to bring it up and to argue for it in good faith.
So how about you, Kevin? You mentioned you didn't really self-censor much anyway in classes. Do you feel the environment has changed at all? Is it easier to speak up even if you didn't really think about it much before? Do you feel like your classmates in the law school classes are more receptive or more open to kind of conservative ideals?
If I'm being candid, I think I expected more critical thought and critical discussion from both directions before I got to Yale Law School.
In what sense?
In the sense that this is a law school, so the idea of legal training is to be able to reason around every side of an argument, right? Mm-hmm. Whether that's the prosecution or the defense or, a conservative legal viewpoint versus a more progressive, moderate, liberal legal viewpoint. And I think I found that lacking in a lot of respects from the student body, not so much from the faculty. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I think it's a little bit trickier to say today while Donald Trump is the president, because I'm not really taking any classes that, bring up these huge, kind of legal issues, as opposed to, if you're taking a constitutional law seminar or an advanced, mm-hmm. Kind of, right. Procedure class. I guess in my legislation class, we do discuss, different theories of statutory interpretation, from the left or more, small d Democrat and, from the right, more originalist kind of methodology. But I think the default from the student body is, well, we're progressive. We think that this policy is good for the people. So that's all we're going to entertain. And I think as a conservative, I'm defense counsel every time I walk into the law school, right? Oh, wow. So I have to be able to maneuver around different, sides of the argument. And I think that probably has its advantages for me. However, it does become exhausting after a while. And this is probably less so in class and more just around social dynamics where, it can become difficult to even have a conversation about something that reasonable people can disagree about when, personalities and the rhetoric and the chaos of what's going on in Washington, almost precludes people from even seeing the legal argument or the policy argument that's on the table, right. If that makes sense.
You kind of lose the ability to explore the issue the politics.
I'll give you a perfect example. If someone says, hey, what do you think about Doge or what do you think about Elon Musk? without even answering that question, it's just like, well, the predicate to that is that he did some weird hand gesture on TV. So, like, I can't even, I don't want to hear anything he has to say. Well, if that's the default position, then we can't talk about Doge. We can't talk about government spending. We can't talk about waste, inefficiency, et cetera, because you just don't like Elon. And so, like, there's no conversation to be had on legal or policy grounds.
Right. So you guys have both kind of touched on how there's like a unique experience of being a conservative in the environment, in whether undergrad or law school. In the fall, there was an op-ed from Publius, or an editorial from Publius, talking about, we're jealous of conservatives for various reasons. They argued like one of the intellectual benefits of being kind of an intellectual minority on campus. Do you feel any of those, kind of being in the position you're in? Do you think there are thin silver linings to having, being in the intellectual minority on campus?
So maybe, I'll take this one. I have a bit of a nuanced view on this. I personally think that, whether you're conservative or you're liberal or you're somewhere in between or you're like none of them, at the end of the day, you are a student, maybe an undergrad, maybe a law student at Yale, and you have an obligation to share your viewpoints, talk about them, argue for them. And, sometimes you're going to be in the majority, sometimes you're going to be in the minority. But also, I've said before on this podcast that if you are in the minority, you might even have a special obligation to speak out. But I don't think that means that liberals should be jealous or envious of conservatives just because they're in the minority more often.
How about you, Kevin? Do you think there's anything you've gained from being in an intellectual minority?
Yeah, so I kind of alluded to it, in my last response that, being nimble around different, different viewpoints and different sides of an argument, I think is the lawyer's job, right? Mm-hmm. But I do think there is something to be said about having to argue from a minority viewpoint all of the time, because it just requires the level of intellectual maneuvering that most people just take for granted, not having to be as part of that minority. I didn't read the op-ed, but, from what it sounds like, it seems like they're pretty on target.
So it's an interesting, I guess, idea that comes up, because you mentioned, especially Supreme Court, conservative majority, with Trump reelected, it's probably going to be majority for a long time. Maybe some of the older conservative justices might retire to be replaced with someone younger. And even I guess I wonder from a legal perspective, and I guess even from undergrad, because in the non-legal side, the White House, Senate, House of Representatives are conservative. Is it weird to kind of be in a position where you're an intellectual minority, or I guess a political minority on campus, whether in law school or undergrad, but then to like look at DC and look at the major institution of law and the major institution of politics are controlled by people who are on your side of the intellectual spectrum?
As a conservative, I would say this is certainly not that weird of a position to be in. I think every time the president is a Republican or conservative, every time the Senate or the House is conservative, it is always the case that, your educational institution is probably still liberal and the law or the political structure leans to the right. Academia in general is just always very left-wing, especially the humanities. Even STEM, to a certain extent, is left-wing, but especially humanities academia. Whereas you see the general population fluctuating between being maybe slightly left-wing to slightly right-wing every 3 or 4 years. And I think that's a big wake-up call to academia that, they're really not in sync with the population. And over time, it does breed mistrust in our universities, in our schools and educational institutions.
So, Kevin, like I said, you said Supreme Court majority is conservative. Is that interesting for you to be like conservative at a law school when the highest institution of law in this country, the highest court, is conservative, and there's kind of that divorce, I guess, separation between the political leaning in the classroom and the political leaning that, determines the final step of the law.
I think it's empowering in a lot of ways to know that. I wouldn't say, we're on the right side of things. Cause,
or at least a lot of people agree with you.
Yeah.
Right. And I think it does kind of take the stink off of being a conservative, because I think for so many years, and maybe even now, the idea of, if you're a conservative, you're a bigot, or, you're a racist, or, you hate women, or like all of these, pejorative kind of talking points, if you still want to stand on that philosophy, then you have to be willing to admit that at least 77 million people in the United States are all bigots, chauvinists, etc. Yeah. And that's just like not the case.
And frankly, if you know any people who voted for Trump outside, in your family life, at home, amongst just normal, regular Americans, you'll very quickly see that people who voted for Trump are not at all necessarily bigots or woman haters or whatever pejorative term the left might want to come up with, as they do every other day.
Well, I think we're out of time here, so I just want to thank you guys so much for coming on the podcast and sharing your thoughts. Really appreciate you joining me.
Thanks a lot for having us.
Thank you.
And now to our interview with Lawrence Perelman, who recently released a new book, American Impresario, William F. Buckley Jr. and the Elements of American Character, and was a close friend of the iconic conservative thinker. I'd like to welcome Lawrence Perelman to the podcast. He's a trained concert pianist and founder and CEO of Semantics Creative Group, a strategic advisory firm working with a wide range of artists, institutions, and companies in the performing arts. He's also the author of the new book, American Impresario, detailing his long and personal relationship with William F. Buckley Jr. through music and looking at how Buckley impacted America for the better, particularly through his battles against communism and anti-Semitism. Encourage all our listeners to pick up a copy. It just came out. Thanks for joining us, Larry.
Thanks so much for having me.
So your relationship with Bill Buckley spanned from an initial letter until almost the moment that he passed away. You were in the next room. What inspired you to write that first letter?
That first letter was inspired by the fact that I came to New York City and I didn't have many friends. I had just been accepted to Manhattan School of Music. And living there, I was very lonely in terms of not having many friends. And, and I realized, what? I was reading one of Bill's books called Happy Days We're Here Again. It was about the early 1990s, and he was somewhat lonely after the Reagan years and the Bush years, especially the Reagan years. And in that book, in that compilation, there were incredible number of classical music pieces, just from his columns about Bach, about experiences himself of playing with orchestra. And I knew of Bill. He was not only knew of, but he was a hero of mine growing up in the 1980s as a vehement anti-communist, as a philo-Semite, as someone who had pushed the anti-Semites out of the conservative movement. And for me and my parents fled the Soviet Union in 1975, so 50 years ago. He always kind of stood as a beacon of hope and inspiration. And I connected the dots, saying that this is a person who really directly influenced my parents by inspiring them to do well in America, to make it here as Soviet Jews. And why not take all of that and write him a thank you letter, basically saying thank you for emboldening Soviet Jews, all of this, and I want to play piano for you as a thank you present. So very enterprising, looking back at myself as an 18-year-old, 30 years ago, to do this. And I sent it off to National Review. I was a very impatient 18-year-old, and I followed up with his office. I sent it FedEx, actually, and basically followed up with his office. And his office said, how would we know? He receives hundreds of letters every week. And I said, I'm the 18-year-old pianist. And incredibly, his assistant, Frances Bronson, who I got to know in later years, said, oh, we did receive your letter, and he'll reply in due course. And she put the phone down on me.
It was so a little bit of hope, and then like a sad,
exactly, and then kind of clink. And I sat there in my really modest. I was in a room in a 4-bedroom apartment. It doesn't sound as glorious as it really as it sounds in terms of 4-bedroom apartment. I was in the single 100 square foot room on the corner of 81st and Broadway. And every day I waited. This was in fall of '94 for a letter for something. And a week and a half later, there was this envelope sitting by the door, just this beautiful white envelope that said William F. Buckley Jr. I had my mail delivered, just left by the door by our landlord. And I opened it up, hoping for the best, but expecting a form letter, just like thanks for writing or whatever. And instead, it was an invitation from Buckley to come and to play for him the following spring. And that, for me, I mean, in terms of inspiration, I carried that around. I'm not even talking about playing for him, which happened 6 months later. I carried around the fact that he had written back to me. It was typed, it was signed by him, everything, but it was obviously dictated by him. Here I was. Who am I? You know, this Jewish kid from St. Paul, Minnesota, writing to Bill Buckley, one of the most important figures in America, cultural figures, popular figures, if you think about his place in popular culture, and also Catholics, right? So and a Yale-ian. I had no connection to Yale or anything. And here's this letter. It gave me so much hope, and waiting for that day, which came in April, almost 30 years ago now, when I played for him at his house on the corner of 73rd and Park. It was just a glow for me, right? I mean, when I write about it in the book, and it's one of those inspirational things that gives you hope that my family coming from nothing, here I was, I could write a letter, and he actually answered. It was a very big deal, and it remains so to me to this day.
I can imagine as an 18-year-old, like that's very validating. And, you know, there were a lot of things that, you know, I wanted to ask about you, about that story in particular, but I think, you know, a lot of our listeners are Yale undergraduates or grad students at the beginning of their careers.
Right.
At 18 years old, you kind of took a leap, wrote a letter to the most, I guess, significant and important thinkers in the country, in in the conservative movement. How did that impact you for the rest of your life? You clearly created a relationship that stuck around for decades, but like, what did it mean for you personally, you know, to have that relationship?
I mean, to read the book, haha, but I would say that to have that relationship was the greatest gift. It was an incredible gift. And for those listening, I would say that, you know, as you venture out into the world, and right now, as you are ventured out, it doesn't matter if you're an undergrad or in graduate school, finding those mentors is truly important, right? I think it is the most important thing to have an elder who is someone who truly believes in what you're up to. Not everyone will. You know, we've met people who, they're not into me, whatever it is. But you find the people who are and you click with. And if those people take a real interest and continue, and you figure out, how do I extend that friendship? How do I extend that relationship? And with Bill, it was extraordinary for me because, yes, there was that first letter. I went to his house. I played piano for him. It was incredible. And it remained in my mind for 3.5 years. Between the first time meeting Bill in the spring of 1995 and the second time, which was in the fall of 1998, there was a 3.5 year lapse, right? So in effect, I like to say we had this 13-year relationship. He passed away in 2008, but in reality, nothing really started until 2008 in terms of an actual friend, until 1998, excuse me, in terms of a real friendship, right? And that's why getting through the door the first time can be tough, but getting through the second time is even tougher. Like, you have to really prove yourself. And in those intervening years, I stayed in touch with Bill. I updated him on my activities. I just he would care, right? I mean, I'd get kind of a cursory note back from him saying, "Oh, you know, thank you for informing me. I do remember you," that kind of stuff. And I kept thinking, "Oh, he remembers me, but is that real or what?" Right. But I had to find the next real hook for him, in a way, like pitching. And that I did after I graduated from Macalester College in 98. I was a political science and music major. I had transferred back from the conservatory in New York. And Macalester is not the most conservative college. It's pretty liberal. And on National Review's list, it was always one of the most liberal colleges, or it didn't even make it on at all. And I jokingly, I would always say this to Bill, you know, it's kind of amazing that this continued, the fact that I had graduated from Macalester, but he didn't care because we were aligned on many different things. And I challenged a lot of my ideas there at Macalester. I had a professor who had a huge poster of Karl Marx in his office. And I remember one of my first days, I said, you know, William F. Buckley Jr. is someone I've met. And I kind of just got this weird look. But anyway,
imagine.
Yeah, exactly. So when I wrote that letter, the key letter, I would say in 1998 after graduation, I said to Bill, I want to do for classical music that which you've done for conservatism in America, to paraphrase my letter. I made a really, really bold statement this time. And I got a call from his office this time saying he wants to see you. And I said, wow, he wants to see me? What does that mean? And I was planning a trip back to New York in the autumn of 98 for some interviews and things like that. And I was a really ambitious kid. I'm sure the people, the students listening to this are ambitious. They're here at Yale. They want to do great things. And I wanted to do great things with classical music and make it more relevant in our society in a very different kind of media landscape than today, where everything's really fragmented. And I wanted to learn from the best, from Bill Buckley, who knew how to get a message out there and to permeate the culture and the media landscape. So I went again, and I met with him in 98, and it just turned out that our comets, in a way, or our asteroids collided at the right moment. And people will find out as you read, the topic of music education came up in a lunch that he was having. And my letter happened to come in at the same time. And it was music education in the city schools. And I wanted to come back to New York City. So all of this was percolating in his mind in September of 98 or so. When I wrote to him, I didn't see him again until November. And I couldn't wait until that meeting in November, but he probably didn't think about me a single time until I walked in again into his apartment. I mean, this was a 5,000 square foot, as they call it, maisonette in New York City, which is a ground floor, you have your own entrance apartment. And he offered me a grant through his foundation, which brought me back to the city. So in terms of his role, how I feel about him, after my parents, he was the most important person in my life. There's no question, up until I got married and had kids and all this kind of thing. But in terms of my formative life, to understand generosity, to understand the importance of communication, of staying in touch, of actually responding to someone's letter, there's no one that shines brighter for me, because those acts actually changed the course of my life.
So what was he like as a person?
As a person, for those of you, here, the students and others listening to this, I mean, you may know Bill Buckley from Firing Line, and watching Firing Line, he is really, he's super intellectual. He's super, at times people would say he gives off an arrogant feel or whatever it is. But Bill was completely accessible. He was completely normal, in effect. I mean, you felt the gravitas in his presence, but he didn't make you feel like nothing. He accepted everyone around him. So he was just, for me, in those interactions, many, many interactions, but especially those early interactions with him, I never felt truly intimidated. I was in part intimidated, let's say, by the fact of who he was, but in terms of how he spoke to me or how he dealt with me, there was total normalcy. I mean, this was a person who was so comfortable in their own skin. He didn't suffer fools, there's no question. But at the same time, he was just a pleasure to be around. He was nice. He was fun. He was warm. He was, for me at that age, it was probably more grandfatherly, right? Fatherly, grandfatherly, especially, or like an uncle, that kind of thing. But it was just a real grasp and a respect for the younger people around him, because he thrived when he was very young because of the support of those around him. So I think he wanted to give that back to generations, and he did that throughout his life. That's what we can also learn about. It was not me-ism with him. It was really, what can I do for others around him in his circle?
So I think there are a lot of students who would love to have a relationship with someone like Bill Buckley, like the one you did. They'd love a mentor as, significant and important, or even just as, knowledged and worldly as Bill Buckley. How would you suggest, nowadays, 20 years after you did it successfully, or, 30 years, I guess, how would you encourage students to try and do that? And what do you think should be the first step?
I think the first step is to really understand who you're writing to or reaching out to, doing research, understanding as much as you can about them, and finding a way to connect with them, to get in touch. And writing a letter, I highly recommend it. I typed the letter on a word processor back in the day, and then I wrote I typed on computers. My handwriting wasn't that great, but if you have great handwriting, I would even do a handwritten letter of some sort. But you have to find the right address, of course. I would recommend FedExing, very old school, to get to the top of the list, because email is not impossible, but breaking through an email is very difficult these days. Phone call, cold call, very difficult too. But I think finding an assistant or finding an address without actually going into a home address or things like that and FedExing is absolutely possible. Also, sometimes LinkedIn can be surprisingly can work really, really well, and it's worked for me. And I still do this. I still do this to this day. I try to find out, who is a person that not only that I need something from, and I think that's what's important. It's not thinking about I need something, but what can you give to that person? Because if it's all about I need a job, I need an opportunity, that's not so interesting for the other person. The other person has to understand, what value are you bringing? Maybe it's implicit in some way that you're bringing it by being a research fellow, or you're bringing it by being a good employee, but maybe even going beyond what the job is and understanding that. And I think had I been another kid, and I'm not diminishing those, because there were many, many, many incredible journalists who are out there today who credit writing to Bill Buckley for their careers.
Wow.
Dozens of them. Everyone from, people who were more traditional conservatives who've morphed in some ways over the years. You just look at it, there's like a litany of people, but everyone from Richard Brookhiser to David Brooks and many in between, in some ways contacted Bill by writing a letter, or someone mentioned a piece that they had written and Bill took an interest. So I think finding that and understanding that it's not just about what I want, but what can they benefit from. And that's what I think Bill saw.
So I want to change the topic a little bit. One of the things you talk about in your book is music. Obviously, your life is based around music, and you talk about how Bill's life from beginning to end was shaped by music, and your relationship was obviously intertwined with music. You argue that it was Buckley's upbringing surrounded by music that enabled him to be the kind of communicator that he was. And obviously, people should read the book, buy a copy.
Of course.
But how did music shape Buckley in your eyes? How did it enable him to become the person that, made such a mark?
That's such a powerful question for me. And in terms of the thesis of the book, in some ways, as you said, it is central in some ways. I mean, for Bill Buckley, if you look back at his childhood, and I did some research on this, and I knew some things just from anecdotes and from him too, he actually grew up in a house with 9 brothers and sisters. There were a total of 10 kids in this house. I can't even imagine. And it was a big estate. I've been up there one time. And they had 5 pianos. They were homeschooled until they went off to boarding schools for middle school and beyond. And his father was not a very cultured man. He was an oilman who wanted his kids, William F. Buckley Sr., wanted his kids to be cultured. And when he thought, what is culture? I have to bring in the best tutors and teachers and others. And that included classical music training. That included piano lessons for all the children. And it was just required. In addition to that, it was required to listen to music. And Bill has some great columns about this, to actually, the kids had to sit in a room with the windows shut and with the curtains drawn and listen to record after record of classical music greats. And this was the 1930s. So there was nothing else, not many other things. You could read books.
Not a lot of distractions.
Yeah,
right?
Not many distractions. But of course, kids wanted to go outside and play, and this was in the afternoon. And Bill writes, everyone was just sitting around saying, when is this going to end? But after about 6 or 8 months, these little kids were hooked. They understood something because it was a language. Music is a language, right? Not to be too predictable here, but it is a language. And for Bill, who grew up actually first speaking Spanish, I think then he spoke French, and then English came, if I'm not mistaken. That's where his kind of iconic drawl, mixed a little bit with the Southern twang there because of his parents, came along. But if you look at it, the musical experiences that he had, I theorize, and also talking to my friends who worked on a couple of books with him, it was like working with a composer. I mean, when he spoke, it was musical in nature. When he wrote like a composer. Just the kind of prose that he produced is mellifluous. I mean, maybe you can't understand everything all the time because of the structure of what he did. But I mean, the really learned can completely, of course, but it challenged people to go and look in the dictionary. It challenged people to go and try to understand fully what he was saying. But he was composing, to me, he was equal to great composers in terms of his output. And if you look at that, I mean, it is prodigious. So how music influenced his worldview is also encompassed in that experience for me with his siblings, sitting and listening to an hour of music every day or every other day.
So I want to wrap up with this last question. This is again a little bit of a teaser from the book.
Right.
You were really there with Buckley in his last couple of days, I don't know if his last moments per se, but you were right next door for his last moments.
Yeah.
What was, people should read the book to get the full story, but how has that impacted you for someone with such a long relationship to have been there, at the very end?
I mean, it was like being in a book. Let me put it that way. It was surreal because the arc of the friendship was such that it almost seemed fateful. The entire friendship ultimately was based on music and these recitals where every 6 or 8 months he would choose a different piece of music for me to play and to learn. And we went through works by Beethoven, works by Bach, other works that I was learning and that I wanted to perform. And I probably did anywhere between a dozen and 15 concerts over those years, which was quite a lot. And he called on me, I realized, in researching the book and going through emails. I have so many emails from Bill between 2006 and 2008, and I lost a lot of emails because of changing computers back when we didn't have the online emails and stuff like that. But I was struck by how much he needed the music in those final months of his life. And to be there at his home the week before he passed away, I played this work, the Diabelli Variations by Beethoven, which to the uninitiated is a tough listen, but I would highly recommend that you listen to it. This was maybe one of Bill's absolute favorite works, definitely by Beethoven, his favorite, and Goldberg Variations probably being his favorite work by Bach. And he kept asking me to learn this piece, and I kept saying no because I really hated it. And I finally agreed when his wife, Pat, who I also knew very well, she passed away in the spring of 2007. And so I took a stab at it during the summer of 2007, and I started to uncover a lot of things and found it very interesting. And this all leads up to February, exactly 17 years ago, when he passed away. And it was the piece that I was to play at his house the day he died for friends in the evening. So there was something in it, in this entire friendship, where he needed the music. He had others who played recitals, of course, but there was something about what I played, maybe how I played, because he had chosen these pieces. They were his favorites, and he could call upon me, and I could come and I could play them. There was something about that was really, in some ways, otherworldly. And the way I look back at that is that he did so much for me, and to be able to carry his message in some way. This is funny when we talk about this because, as a Jew, I do look at it as a little bit of being a disciple of William F. Buckley Jr.'s. I would say that I feel a little bit of my mission in life with this book is to make sure that people don't forget his virtues, and that we can learn from them. And in this year, his 100th anniversary of his birth, that it's kind of the responsibility of those who knew him to be able to bring his message in some way to people.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you joining us. Thanks for coming up to New Haven, and thanks for sharing what I thought was beautiful insights about your relationship with a great man.
Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it. And thanks for the great questions.
And please, everyone, go online and get a copy of American Impresario. It's just out. It's a fantastic read. Thanks so much. And that wraps up another great episode of Pod and Man at Yale. Like and subscribe if you haven't already, and always remember, for God, for country, for Yale, in that order.